Hello and welcome to the Marketing Times Analytics Podcast. Today we're on with Mark Donnigan. Mark, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, sure. Thanks for having me on, Alex. Mark Donnigan. I am a virtual CMO, which I understand has a lot of definitions. But basically, I work with a very small number of companies, really only one or two at any one time. I engage for many years with my clients. I stay very focused in the space that I'm in. I work in a particular area of technology related to video streaming. So if you watch Netflix, if you enjoy Disney Plus, any of these great streaming platforms, then the companies I work with are probably supplying technologies that you're seeing. And yeah, I come in, I join companies usually at stages where they are either they've reached product market fit and now it's like a scale up, pedal to the metal, meaning they were a little scrappy in their marketing to that point and now it's okay, we've raised a round, we really need to put fuel on the fire. In other cases I join where maybe marketing is not executing in the way the business needs. And often because of my exposure in the market, the founders reach out and say, hey, Mark, maybe you can help us. And so I get involved and have a lot of fun, build great businesses. I'm really proud of the work that me and my team have done.
Before we continue, a quick note from our sponsor, which is the SearchMaster app that I've developed. So in less than 30 seconds, I'm going to show you how to run a AI competitive search analysis for your business. So you go to searchmaster.app and scroll down. You don't even have to log in. It'll show you your AI search rankings. Let's say your business is Rolex and you want to see, are the AIs ranking you as the best watch company or is there somebody ahead of you? So we're going to click enter. And right now, SearchMaster is interfacing with Gemini, Claude, and ChatGPT and asking them, what are the competitors to Rolex and how does Rolex rank relative to these competitors? And we can see that all of three of the AIs are ranking Rolex in the number one position with Patek Philippe at number two. So this gives you really interesting high-level insights about the competitive set that the AI tools consider you to be in. So when people are asking about which watch they should get in let's say the luxury market, you can be confident that the AIs are recommending you first. This is only showing a small set of the competitors, but if you get started for free, there is a free plan that's free forever. You can see a full list of competitors available at searchmaster.app. Sign up today. Thank you. And now back to the podcast. Obviously, you work in a lot of areas. What would you say are some of the main subject areas that you cover in marketing?
Yeah, it's a great question. So my background is actually in sales. I started my career, so rewind it when I was in junior high, 12 years old, actually, I discovered my school's Apple II in the math department. And the school had three Apple IIs, one obviously in the math department. Taught myself basic and just really, I was a geek back then. We didn't really say developers. It was more like a programmer, but went into a computer science program. Along the way, didn't end up finishing my computer science degree because I went to music school. I decided I wanted to be a rock star. Obviously, that didn't quite work out, or else maybe you'd recognize my name. But through that, I had a real interesting self realization or whatever, where I realized I have a very strong right brain and a left brain. And for me, I work very seamlessly between them. And that's also how I ended up in marketing, because marketing is very creative. There's also a strategic, very structured component to it, which of course, you know about, Alex, when you're working in the data space, analytics, you're trying to make sense of everything coming off a digital platform. But yeah, in those early days, I also figured out that I didn't want to be a poor, starving musician. So I was actually playing at a pretty high level, and I saw players that I respected who were much better than me, and they were working at McDonald's. I can remember one of my friends was driving a school bus, and nothing wrong with those jobs. Even in my very early 20s, I went, is this the path that I want to go? So found my way into sales. And then as my career began to grow there, I was always in more B2B type selling environments and eventually was leading teams. At kind of the peak of my sales career, I was driving $35 million a year in sales across a dozen sellers. And we were in this particular space we were in, that was pretty significant revenue. Everything's contextualized. There's certain environments here where it's maybe one sales rep's driving 35 million, but where I was. So yeah, so then that just through that process of sales, then I began to really become a student of marketing, because it's one thing to be an individual contributor, be an individual salesperson out there just knocking on doors and making calls, and you're always wanting more marketing. But when you're responsible for a big number, now you say, hey, what are all the tools that I have at my disposal? And marketing was the obvious one that in a few situations, I actually also managed and had the marketing team and marketing resources reporting to me as the head of sales. So then that gave me that front row seat to the power of marketing. And that pulled me in to ultimately where I am today. And so the way that I approach marketing is a little bit different. I'm revenue first. I'm very practical. And so a lot of times when I join and I start working with a company, the very first thing I want to do is let's get out in the field. Let's understand, what are the challenges? What are your customers saying? And everybody on the surface says, oh, here's what our customers are telling us. I'm like, but really, do we really know that? Let's go out and let's listen. Let's not go out with our list of questions that are pre-scripted, that are going to lead someone to give us maybe answers we want to hear. And that, combined with really knowing how a product works and how technology works, has been really my superpower. So again, the area that I work in, I actually understand the process of video encoding. Now, I'm not an engineer. I'm not a codec developer, but I understand the process. And so it allows me to listen to the customer. It allows me to get feedback from the engineering team. And then that directly leads into how we structure our marketing messages, because I can pick up on things that maybe someone else would say, oh, but we should just simplify that message. I'm like, yes, it's one thing to simplify, but it's another thing to be speaking to simplify to a point that the customer has no idea what you're even saying. And too much marketing gets simplified to that point. Nice, catchy 7-word marketing messages, 5-word marketing messages, very compact. The marketing team's so excited. We nailed the messaging. And the market's like, we have no idea what you guys do. What do you mean? It's so simple. Look, it's 5 words. They're like, we have no idea. So that's really both my superpower and my focus. It's as simple as really understanding the buyer, understanding why they buy, understanding how they buy, and then understanding what the product does. You don't have to be an engineer. So I'm still not an engineer. I'm not building these solutions, but I understand.
Yeah, that's very powerful. I think there's a lot that can be taken away from that. I would love to learn a little bit more about that research process. And when you say that you're going into the field, are you also looking at data about audiences? And if so, what kind of data?
Okay, so let's talk about what going into the field means. And then I think that's a good lead into how would you use data, or what data would be useful. Now, one of the things that I think is very important in marketing is, so let's talk about personas and segmentation, which is like the ground truth when you're going to put a data lens on marketing. And that's a base level job to be done, right? Especially when a new head of marketing, new VP of marketing, new CMO comes in. Usually almost one of the very first things, there's a lot of first things they're going to do. It's like, hey, where's our personas? Who do we sell to? And for the most part, every company can go dust off. Some are a little more polished and a little more ready than others. Some is kind of like, wow, we put this together 5 years ago and haven't ever looked at it. But everybody has something that they can send. The problem is that here's what the persona is. Okay, it's job title. We sell to primarily directors and senior directors of engineering, occasionally who report to a VP, and ultimately the budget is owned by a CIO or a CTO or maybe the CEO. And so basically the job title. And then there's some other information around it. There may be some other demographic type information, maybe, although in a lot of B2B, that's irrelevant. So it doesn't matter if they're 25 to 35 or 35 to 45 or whatever. But there's some other information around that. Could even be, depending on what your product is, it could be the domain background. So the industry, just the overall experience, how experienced these people, there can be all these things. Here's the problem with this approach, and this is why so many analytics efforts that I have seen ultimately end up with, on one hand, getting a wow, this is amazing, meaning that, wow, all this data, look at all this data we have. And then at some point soon after, it's, but what do we do with it? And then gets shelved. And anybody who's honest that, and where I'm working anyway, says, you know what, unfortunately, there's way too much great data work that just gets shelved. So why does it get shelved? And in my experience, what I have seen is the reason is, and I have a very practical example. I won't name the name of the service, but I get called all the time from these business development companies that are, hey, we can produce lists. We all get those calls, right? And my favorite question is, I say, okay, I'll tell you what. I say, in my experience, these have never worked for us. Oh, but we're different. And they give their sales pitch, right? And I say, okay, I'll tell you what. We're already doing business with, and I name this company, and it's public information. So I said, so I'm not asking you to give me a freebie. This isn't a freebie. They're already our customer. You can verify. Yeah. Okay. So I'm not asking you for a freebie. Tell me who the buyer is. Oh, okay. But what's the title? I said, doesn't matter. It's a video engineer. Oh, they come back with a whole list of names. The person who's the buyer is never one time on that list. Not even one time have I had somebody. And I have to believe that these companies, maybe some are better than others. And so I don't really have a way to judge, but I have to assume that if they're around, if they're established, they must have some systems at work. In other words, they have a process. And the point in illustrating that, not only when I'm making the case for why I can't use these services, but my point to marketers is that you cannot deduce your buyer to a role. Can't do it, because the buying process today is so vast. There are anywhere from a dozen to more influencers and decision makers. And the real challenge that we face, and again, this is the space that I operate in. Someone might be listening and saying, that works great in my space. Awesome. But when you're selling licensing technology that is $500,000 a year, $1 million a year, when you're doing deal sizes that are 5 million, 6 million, $10 million a year, there is always a range of influencers that if you don't have them mapped, you'll miss them with just broad segmenting. So if I stop there, it sounds like, Mark, you're saying data's, throw it out the window. There's nothing you can do with it. It's actually, there is a very important role for data. But the important role for data is to have mapped through the human process, getting out in the field, knowing not just, okay, the decision holder in this particular company for this particular technology that I was giving an example of may have a particular title. And her title is, I believe now it is vice president, but I think actually it's senior director of this particular functional group. There's nothing video in her title. And maybe now there is. I don't know. I may just not be remembering. But the point is that you're not going to just go do some search on LinkedIn for the same title, come up with a list of 100 names, which you will come up with a list of 100 names. But half of those people, more than half in their organization, would be like, I don't have anything to do with that. Yeah, I have video in my title, but I'm involved in this other aspect. of our video workflow or our video production or whatever it is. And so you have to map it. And then you have to map the individuals that are the decision makers. And what I'm really saying is not the ones who can say yes, but the ones who can say no. Because in a big enterprise deal, it's the people that can say no that will tank it. And this is something, and I know this from scars and a lot of mistakes. I can remember being involved in so many deals that went sideways where all the way up until the end, we're like, yeah, of course, going to be a Q3 deal. This is absolutely closing. And then it doesn't close. And we're going, what happened? The decision makers they all had told us, we have emails, we didn't make this stuff up. And then we do a postmortem and you say, because we totally missed this subject matter expert, this other subject matter expert. We didn't miss them. We knew they were there. We just discounted them. Like we discounted the fact that if they said no, that the decision makers weren't going to override. And so the way that data can serve in this sort of environment is that I think data is more useful to map and to track engagement of your marketing efforts, content, etc. Because although maybe we don't care as much about whether we're not going to say, oh, we have to get 1,000 impressions on this LinkedIn post because that means it's good. Maybe 100 is great. Maybe, but you know what? It's super helpful to have telemetry on your system so that you can see, for example, wow, we just went in and had a meeting with a really big company in Cupertino last week. And guess what? In the last 72 hours, we had 40 IP addresses from Cupertino hit our website and go to this particular technology page. Odds are pretty good. They're from that company. Now, how you then correlate what to do with that information or just what that means, that's all contextual. And so then, you have to understand that's the level of detail, and that transcends what I'm talking about just at the simple level, click-through rate and clicks and all. That's like a different level of data that gets fed back. And I was recently involved in a process where this exact scenario is what happened. And the team went in, had this meeting, and guess what? Within a short period of time later, there were 40 hits from Cupertino, and those who are in technology would know the company that I'm referencing. And nobody had to be convinced that most likely 100% it was individuals from this company. It's wow. Okay. All right. Now, and then we were able to put together a whole process of what to do with that. What does that mean?
Yeah, that's really powerful. And when you're designing ads, or when people are designing ads for these types of contextually aware creatives, for contextually aware creative, what is informing that messaging? Is it actual research, like conversations with those types of personas?
100% it is research, but it's interesting that you said research with those personas or those individuals or those decision makers, because it's research, but it's not the latest Gartner report. This might be a little controversial, but for the most part, the analyst reports are not going to be very useful. Because the problem is that by very definition, when someone like a Gartner or a Forrester, PwC, fill in whoever, when they're writing at such a high level, they're writing basically for two audiences. They're writing for literally you can count them on one hand. So if they're writing a semiconductor report, PwC recently published one, they're writing it for Intel, for NVIDIA, for AMD, for Broadcom, and a half dozen other companies. That's it. Everyone else is at just such a different level, different part of the value chain, different part of the market, et cetera, that it's meaningless information. But the problem is that marketers, because in some cases, let's face it, that's all you have to put your finger on. So marketers then grab that. In my experience, what I've seen happen, grab it, go build a whole bunch of plans around it. Or in some cases, it's not even the marketer, it's the CEO. CEO goes and grabs the latest PwC and says, see, we're just like this company. So we have to go tell that story and we have to build. And maybe in that case, the head of marketing is even standing in the middle going, wait a second, like we're not in video with all due respect yet. Like we're working to get there, but we're not there. Or whatever you can go with the comparisons, the analogies. And so then you say, okay, then where do I get this research? I have to have some information to act on. And so where do I get that? I think that's where this research, as you use the word, that needs to come through the sales team. But it ultimately needs to be owned. It needs to be sourced by the marketing department. It can't be third party, because if the marketing department is having to take everything through an intermediary, if you think of it that way, you know what? A salesperson's going to have a particular twist on how they see the market, how they see that person responding, and then let's face it, a salesperson, the personalities, they may or may not have that analytics mind that is needed to present it. It's not because they're misrepresenting information. It's different personalities, it's different jobs, right? And so if marketing is not right there, being able to gather the information on the field directly, call it first party data. We love that, right? Marketing has to get their first party data, and their first party data is directly from the customer. It's not filtered through either a Gartner report on one end or through a sales team, which may or may not have the ability to really get into the nuance that's required. That's how I have found, you can see, and I've been very clear about it. I believe the head of marketing's job is, I think the reason why a lot of marketing heads churn, it's pretty well known that the CMO chair was about an 18-month job for a lot. And sadly, you can look on LinkedIn and see even some very accomplished CMOs, and you kind of look at their job history and it's like, yep, every 20, 24, 30 months, they're on to the next company. And I have learned that it's not because those people aren't good at their job. They would have never gotten hired in the first place if they didn't have some fundamental skills, but they were focused on the wrong things. They thought their job was to be the brand police. They thought their job was to create a new website, build a new logo. They thought their job was to build, and actually their job was to go out and map the ecosystem and then bring that first party data from them back into the marketing team and then implement it in message. And yes, that manifests on the website. Yes, that may manifest in a change to the brand, but it's a different direction. It's not just, oh, our brand is dated, let's go do a whole branding exercise. No, let's understand the customer. And then we may say, whoa, it's like this really is impacting because the customer sees us through this very outdated and, doesn't understand what we're really doing today.
Yeah, I think that's really powerful. Yeah, it's like you're a mind reader, because a lot of this stuff is like really relevant to the work that I'm doing right now. It is really,
and we didn't talk about this in advance, Alex. No. So for the listeners who are like, oh, they had an outline.
Yeah. So yeah, I totally agree, and I love the way you put it, that the job of the CMO is to map the ecosystem that the company is playing in, because that just orients everybody to what's going on in the world around the company. And I've seen instances where there is a misalignment between the reality that the marketing team is responding to and the reality of the ecosystem around the company. And if those are mismatched, the messaging is not going to resonate.
That's right. And so it's to put an exclamation point on this. It's not uncommon for me to get a call that is some variation of. I've never really gotten a call that's been like, hey, my head of marketing stinks or, or whatever. But after I get called and I start talking, the CEO kind of says, we recently let someone go, or we had someone leave, or we have a question mark around this person who's sitting in the chair now. And we almost would like you to come in. If they're gone, then it's okay. We need someone to come in and help us here. If they're still there, it's almost, we'd like you to give your perspective. I have yet to walk into one of those situations where I've had to say, yeah, you're right. This person has no idea what they're doing. I haven't. Now, that doesn't mean that I haven't encountered people who maybe needed some growth and in some areas just lacked fundamental experience. Of course, we all do, right? But even in those cases, I've been able to say, hey, yeah, they really need to up level in this area. But you know what? They're actually doing a great job over here. And the response I get back, then why aren't we getting the leads? And I'd say, because they're executing well, but they're executing the wrong thing. So if we can aim them, if we can reorient them, if we can, in other words, if we can align that execution, I'll bet you actually they'll perform very well. And then I always point out too, I say, now let's think about this. If we replace them, what are the odds that you're going to get someone who's basically going to be just like them? In other words, we're going to have, and then usually that sinks in and it's, oh, yeah. So I said, so let's work with them. And so I found this repeatedly where there has been, and again, I use kind of the air quotes, a failure, is that it's not often a failure of the work they're doing. It's a failure of alignment. It just goes back to what we've been talking about the last 25 minutes or so here. It's a failure of fundamentally understanding, how does the market think? How does the market receive messaging? How does the market buy? What does the market care about? And once you get that aligned, and if there's the execution process, like just being able to produce the graphics at scale, write well, all of the tactical things that then have to be done, all of a sudden marketing starts to take off. And it's kind of like, whoa, Mark, what did you do? I'm like, yeah, there's some very practical things, but a lot of times it's about that alignment. So to the
Yeah.
market.
Yeah. So there's a lot of qualitative data that
Yeah.
is the foundation of a lot of
Yeah.
marketing. And then the quantitative data comes in later once it's
Yeah.
time to
Yeah.
fine tune.
That is so well put, because not only am I conscious of the focus of your show and the focus of why I assume most of your listeners are here, and that being analytics and data, but it is so important because, again, if someone were to just turn us off at this point and they could maybe walk away with the wrong impression, and it's, oh, this guy thinks that you don't need data, you don't like the value of analytics. Is no, quite the opposite. But the problem is that if you're trying to apply data when your messages are not even hitting the mark to the audience, first of all, not only your analytics going to be bad and everything's going to look really miserable, but even if it doesn't, you could be over here, you meaning the marketing team could be celebrating, look at our, I hate to use MQLs because that's the example. Look, we're getting all these form bills. And then it's a proverbial sales is going, yeah, and no one will return our phone call. And when I do get them on the phone, they're like, oh, I have no idea what you're talking about. And so that's what we want to avoid, is marketing either being like super depressed and not wanting to show any of the data because it's so lousy, because again, disconnect, or marketing going, look, we're hitting all of our targets or most of our targets. And then sales is going, well, it's not helping us. And then ultimately the CEO is going, I don't know what the issue is here, but clearly marketing isn't working. And so after you get this foundational work done, then you go into that quantitative. You go into the quantitative, and then that becomes markers for how well you're executing. And then that quantitative data allows you to say, hey, we know that from this particular channel, email, just to pick one. We know that we have a certain cadence, we have a certain way that we're structuring our content, certain things that we're talking about. Hey, now let's start really dissecting this. And do we need to bifurcate? Do we need two newsletters? Do we need one for this segment of the audience and of the market? Which I do actually like using the word audience when I think about this, for this segment, and another for this. And then should that look different? And then it's data that's going to inform whether we're on the right track or not. And it's data. So it does come back to analytics, but it's after you've got this foundational work done.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I'm curious your approach to long-term versus short-term campaigns and messages, because another issue when you're trying to measure marketing performance is if there's too many things changing and there's no clear baseline to measure against, then it's like, how do we know what good is if we don't
Yeah.
have some long-term sort of evergreen campaign? What's your approach to that? Do you always make
Yeah.
sure there's an evergreen campaign and message, or how do you approach it?
Let me say this. I think also you have to map these strategies back to the sales cycle, the business process, how you go to market. So this is where, if you're working inside a SaaS company, and I'm just going to throw out some rough targets. These are by no means hard and fast, but if you're working inside a SaaS company where it's a pretty straightforward licensing model, you probably have some sort of PLG, product led growth. Basically, it's free to use the product. There's probably some first paid tier that is basically just a pro, $20 a month, $50 a month, just for an individual user. And then there's an enterprise deal, right? I'm not saying there isn't complexity in that, but that's a pretty straightforward, like, buying model, revenue model. And then if your sales consideration cycle is, let's say, within 90 days to maybe 4 or 5 months at the longest, in other words, it's less than 6 months, I think it's a lot more possible to run a control. And then, because let's face it, your control for that cohort only needs to run for like 5 months, maybe 4 months. And so you run it, and then meanwhile you're testing some other variations of whatever creative. And we're talking right now primarily about advertising, obviously. Then you can do that. But if you're compare that to business cycles, sales cycles that I'm involved in, where it's literally 2 years. I'm thinking of one deal that the sales cycle from the very first touch to the first PO was 25 months, more than 2 years. And the team celebrated how quickly the deal closed. I would like to be involved in that. Now, we are talking multiple millions of dollars over. In other words, so the size of the prize makes all that work, right? If that was a $500 a month software license, that business is not going to survive. It's not. But in that scenario, then there is no such thing as a control, because in 25 months, even the way that the market sees the company and sees the product is going to change. So if we were to run some sort of a control for 25 months, people be like, what are you doing? And then what would happen as well is there's going to be natural decay as the market evolves, because in this particular example that I'm thinking of, the company had been in the market roughly about 3 years with a product that was a brand new category, like brand new. In those first 3 years, it was just educating the market that there even was a need, even educating the market. Once the market said, okay, we get there's a need, there were some technology biases that had to be overcome. There was the way the product was built, people had legacy thinking. And they're like, yeah, okay, we understand, but that's an old way to build it. Why would you do it that way? And so there was this education. By the time this particular deal was in the deal cycle, some of that education had been done. So if the company had just continued to run with that, like it wouldn't have worked. It would have been really out of sync and a lot of either false positive or false negative, exaggerated negative data. So I'm trying to give some examples here of where, again, it's not to say it depends and it's not to say everything is contextual, but it really is. You have to think about this in terms of what your deal cycle is, and then look at what trends could be happening in the market, or even depending on what your product is or what the company does, could be in the economy. It could be, there's so many factors, right? So that makes it a little bit challenging to do the exact, hey, I've got my control and then I have my test. So you have to do your best, because you obviously do. The point that you raise is absolutely critical. I've fallen into this so many times where it's like, hey, we got a great result on the new fill in the blank, new set of ads, whatever. And then, but we have no idea why, because we changed so much.
Yeah.
And then you step back, you go, okay, let's try something else. You try something else and it all tanks. And you're like, but we have no idea why, because we changed so much, So
Yeah, that is super interesting. And I think that that's where really good test design plays a big role.
yeah.
And like you said, those holdout or those control groups are super important.
Yeah. And I think, just to wrap up what I was saying, it's not that you can't test if you have a 25-month sales cycle, because it also is not true. You think 24 months, that's 2 years. There's people who leave the company, there's new people who come in, and with a deal of this kind of size, it's only natural. There's going to be people get promoted. So a manager who was originally really key in the buying committee all of a sudden gets promoted or is in a totally different group. Next thing you know, he or she is out of the buying committee. And those things absolutely will happen over a 2-year period of time. Now you have a new person who suddenly pops up, and when they're trying to get up to speed, and maybe they have a different view, and maybe they have their favorite vendor and all of this. So it's a series of sales cycle mini loops that happen over this 25-month period of time. And unfortunately, they're not always really definable, but some of them are. There's a very clear, hey, there's going to be initial POC in a lab. It's going to start on September 1st. It's scheduled to run for 60 days. All right. Now, that's not exactly a sales loop, but in a way it is, because it's a very defined set of activities that if there is not a positive outcome, then the whole deal could go south just based on that. And I think you can begin to map, and when you might look at the way messaging, this is not the best example because you're not going to be running ads against this POC. But if you know that there's a regular POC cycle in your sales process, there very well could be content that you want to be pushing on certain channels. And so maybe you test, maybe you say, hey, what if we push this angle, and then we have some cohorts that we test with, and then we have another set of cohorts that we push a little bit of a different angle. They're both doing POCs. So we're at least testing against the same activity. Now that's how you could actually then, in a way, do a control.
Yeah, that's a very powerful idea. We talked about so much, and you have so much experience. I know we could continue for a long time, so we'll definitely have to do a follow-up episode. But before we go, I wanted to quickly ask you about generative engine optimization and just your current perspective on how businesses should approach that.
SEO and GEO. This must be about the hottest topic on any marketing forum or community everywhere. My perspective, which is, I will say, well-informed opinion, because I do have to say opinion, because I don't know that any of us really know precisely how all this sort of is going to play out, but I'm in the middle of it every day. So that's what I mean by well-informed. Is our job still is to provide the information that our buyers and the market needs to make a decision for our product, for the product that we're marketing or the technology or the service. That hasn't changed. Now, the fact that there's certain techniques that we used to use, and I would argue, why would we really fundamentally stop? There still is Google. People still go to Google. Google still is running their ranking algorithms. We still have websites, right? So I would argue, I hope people aren't just stop pulling off all their metadata off the website. I'm sure no one's doing that, right? So it's like, we're still going to keep doing that, but our job is to produce the highest quality or the highest impact content that's going to cause someone who's in a buying cycle for one of our products, services, or technologies to hopefully say, hey, I want to buy this company's solution. How does that relate to generative optimization, generative engine, GEO, or there's other terms, but everybody knows what we're talking about? Is it the search engines ultimately are the search engines, the LLMs are ultimately bringing all of this information in. They're vectorizing it, they're analyzing it. And so the higher quality the content is, the better the probability that it's going to get surfaced. And that sounds super high level, almost random, almost that's just the luck of the draw. But the point is that is controllable. And by producing high quality information, you're going to positively impact sales cycles. And at the end of the day, there is no B2B, it's human to human. And so take all the LLMs out, take Google out of the equation, it still is Mark and Alex who if we're working in an industry, Alex comes to work every day and he's tasked with making certain buying decisions or contributing to buying decisions. Mark is coming to work every day. He's tasked with selling and getting guys like Alex to buy the product. But at the end of the day, it's Mark and Alex. And it's Mark and Alex using all the LLMs, but also talking to colleagues, going to trade shows, Googling, going to web. And my view is, and I am smack dab in the middle. I'm even building custom tools. And so I'm investing very heavily for marketing application using AI. And so I'm right in the middle of this. So I am a forward leaner, if you will, very much forward leaner into the use of agents and building solutions. But I always remind myself at the end of the day, it's Mark and Alex. At the end of the day, it's human to human. So I hope that's helpful, but that's my view on it. All the tactics then are very important at some level, but at the most basic foundational level, I think that I'm seeing too many discussions. They're going down into, here's how to ensure that your website is indexed by ChatGPT. Okay, but I can tell you, if your site is being indexed by ChatGPT and your content is inappropriate to the audience, I don't mean inappropriate as in immoral or whatever, but if it doesn't meet the need, then it's not going to get surfaced. It's not going to show up. So,
yeah. And that's back to the point about fundamentals being the first step before any of that optimization happens. And I'm so glad that you mentioned building tools for AI. I actually built one recently. It's this one, SearchMaster.app, and it's all about geo and SEM analysis.
I need to check it out, by the way, because I am looking for a tool for that. So
awesome. Yes. Yeah. And I'm continuing to make improvements every week. So I would love to hear your thoughts about it. And I'll put a link in the description below. And I also wanted to give you a chance, Mark, to share any tools or that you've built or that you recommend with the audience.
Yeah. So the tools that I'm building at this point, I am keeping for myself. So I say at this point, who knows? But if anyone was interested to read more about what I think about the things that we have discussed, go to my website. It's growthstage.marketing. growthstage.marketing. So it's a .marketing domain, just growthstage.marketing. I'm sure you'll link up to it, Alex. And I have many books up there. Everything's ungated, totally free, obviously. I believe in just giving away what I've learned over the years. And so if you find it useful, send me a message. I'm on LinkedIn. I'm very easy to find.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Mark. I really appreciate your thoughts. I know the audience learned a lot. Thank you, everyone, for listening, and we'll talk to you soon.